question is to ask ourselves, what kind of model do we want to have of the global financial structure, or architecture for that matter? And or what is our wish list in this? And for us, it's very, very important for two reasons. One, it has become like we need a collective action to get to where we want to be. But for us to be there and to have a sustainable position, we have to ask ourselves, how did we get there in the first place? Where did the rain start beating us? Many years back when I was a student of literature, there was always some saying that first you have to make sure that you understand where you dropped the thread, because you'll be forced to take it to pick it up. And the second thing is that if you have to reform, you have to understand that you cannot separate the dance from the dancer. Interesting, because I thought the dance and the dancer were different, but actually you cannot separate them. So essentially, and as I'm talking to my friend here, Serim, we have to be together. IMF must be part of the game. The World Bank must be part of the game. So you cannot separate the dance from the dancer. That is, for me, very, very important, because the starting point is to say, what is our wish list? What kind of structure do we think? And where did the problem start? And you can imagine, where did the problem start, for example? All of a sudden, because we are always there, the conditions were becoming so tough. So they were creating accessibility. And it happens even in our own domestic market. I went to a bank, and for purposes of this discussion, it will not be revealed which bank. And I wanted to get a loan. And the conditions, I could not. Then I said, here is the Minister of Finance who cannot even contract a loan in a Kenyan bank, commercial bank. Then it means if the Minister of Finance cannot access a loan in a bank, then who can access a loan in the bank? But it's a reality, isn't it? First, the interest rate structure was so bad, I cannot bear with it. And second, with my current salary, I cannot service such a loan. Now, I may be more privileged than 45 million Kenyans, but you can imagine if I can't, then the next question is, who borrows from those banks? It's a question we can ask ourselves. And I'm sure in your own specific countries, you are going to do that. But that is not the issue I wanted to lay out. I wanted to lay out, suppose what I needed to do with the funds must be done. So it means I have to look for other ways, isn't it? That is what happened in the global financial architecture. You cannot access. Most of our countries went to the international capital market. There was nothing wrong. In 2014, when Kenya entered the international capital market, I am on record for having said that it is important that we have a third dimension of a financial instrument that will allow us to price domestic assets appropriately. I was on record. But I did know that it was not a precious bane after all. Anyway, we can debate that, and it's an interesting debate. But that is what we want to cure now, and that is very, very important. The second point I wanted to make is that we have a development agenda. That agenda is well defined and I think understood across, because we have been buffeted by shocks. A country like Kenya, we are unwinding from different dimensions. Different dimensions because we have been buffeted by shocks that are persistent to the point where they have created a permanent effect or structural effect. They require reforms to get out of that. Second, if you look at the last 7 years or so, growth in Kenya was actually driven by public sector. Public sector was investing very heavily in infrastructure. Infrastructure itself is good. To close the infrastructure gap is very good. But it also comes with its own challenges, because it also bites the prices of non-tradable goods. So in a sense, you have to observe that you have to allow the exchange rate to adjust, the nominal exchange rate to adjust, because it becomes the automatic stabilizer. But in those 7 years, what was hard is that we also managed the exchange rate. It was not a floating exchange rate. In the process, there was misalignment, and you can see how expensive it has been to unwind that. So it's an expensive thing. One of the things is that our debt to GDP at one time, the cost of debt servicing cost rose to about 0.9% of GDP. We had in the first 3 months of this fiscal year, we had a supplementary one. And the question I was asked by Parliament is, why are you coming this early? And I explained that. You can imagine. So now, for us to get out of that, we have to have a development agenda. And that development agenda must be supported by solutions that are also coming from an appropriate source. That is why the global financial architecture becomes very important, because we have to access the resources first in times of flexibility, how they can solve the current problems that we are facing, and different countries are facing different problems, and they can be sorted out by different solutions. Second is to accept that you can also generate innovative solutions that are quite consistent. And third, the resources must be, everybody has been talking about fit for purpose. I would like actually to say, yes, fit for purpose, so that you can actually construct instruments that are going to fit that particular country, rather than construct an instrument that you apply across and some people feel this is not consistent with us. That is something that we want to do. But finally, which has been talked about, is the quantum of resources. Of course, we will not get resources that at scale which is infinite. It has to be bounded. But that boundary is substantially consistent with the demands of the particular country that you want. But I think at the end of it all, it is how innovative solutions can work and how we visualize they can work, and they can be monitored. I do believe, by the way, I do believe that solutions, once they are agreed and they can be applicable, can be monitored very easily. We used to talk about that is assessment, or an assessment, or in terms of assessing performance. And it was very, very critical, because we thought that was the most important thing. But that appraisal is that it's going to be important for us to keep the faith, and that will create even an endogenous momentum to actually achieve. But if it is not consistent with the endogenous ambitions, then it becomes alien, and nobody wants to adhere to the parameters that you agreed on. And that is where we start failing. I was giving an example to my team, to my ED, that in about the year 2000 or so, there was a book that was being developed by the World Bank, and it was asking a question. Did conditionalities with the IMF and the World Bank during the structural adjustment period lead to reforms? And they wanted to launch that book for Africa and here in Kenya. And because I was working with Kipra, I allowed it. The answer to that question was that no, those conditionalities did not lead to reforms, because those reforms were resisted, because those reforms were hurting some economies and hurting some sectors, and because those reforms were not well understood as well, because essentially they started with the negative aspects, for example, the social sector. But what happens is that some of the countries reformed, but they reformed because of the crisis. The crisis, when they were hit by the crisis, even the populace and the political economy lowered down the expectation and pushed for reforms. Of course, the joke about it is that don't look for reform, don't look for a crisis so that we can speed up reforms. But it was an interesting debate. So there is a suggestion that we can come up with a working group. And a working group should have issues. And I started by asking why new funding architecture is necessary. is because there is a new world order, and we cannot deny it. We cannot rely on the old world order. Two, we have to look at the conditions and the conditionalities that will matter, that can be endogenously understood and agreed on. Because conditions will still matter. Even as we have conditions in work. I signed my performance contract. And if you don't want to call those conditions, they are conditions. A performance contract is a condition. I did sign that. But I did sign on the understanding that I'm going to perform. I did sign on the understanding that I should also be allowed space when I want to perform. You see, that's a very important space, isn't it? So it means that if I were to fail, I need to really look at avenues that prevented me from getting there. And the final point I want to make is that we have to know the space. And this is very, very important for us. It is not the space we are told about. We have to know our space. We know the specifics, and we know the economy we are dealing with. There are several times I've actually walked a different path and asked people, do you know that the economy you have described, I don't know that economy. Let me tell you the economy I know. It's because we have missed connecting the dots most of the time. And that is why we are resisting the current financial architecture. That's why I'm saying we need to reform the current financial architecture, because when it is now relating to a country called Kenya, and you feel that the characteristics are totally different, and the conditions that you want to, or the goals you want to achieve are totally not consistent with what you think, then it means that you don't know the space. So the whole issue is that this working group must understand the space. It is true that one of the common denominators is resources. But I think those resources, because they are also going to be competed, it means that they have to be driven by certain boundaries and characteristics and institutional DNA. And for me, this is where we want to make sure that we know the economy we are dealing with, and we know where we want to take that economy. I do believe that the agenda for us is very, very important, but I wanted to make those points because I thought this is, we have, even by the time we come to redefining what we want, we already have an idea that the pain we have gone through, we want to say never again. I was giving an example to the ED this morning. After every crisis, or like the shocks that are hitting us, you have to effect some reforms. Because you are telling yourself, if this crisis or this shock came because I did not look into those aspects in the earlier part, I need to think about it. Never again should I be hit by such a crisis, isn't it? So it means you have to reform. But if you go with and navigate the shocks and do nothing after that, it will come back to hit you, and it will be harder than the previous time. As you can imagine, I remember when the COVID-19 was resolved, I think Bill Gates came up with a book saying that how to prepare for the next pandemic. Because what he's saying is that we should never allow another pandemic to hit us. So every crisis should ignite reforms. Those reforms are country-specific because they rely on the country's characteristics. So that's why I'm very happy about this working group, because this working group will actually make sure that it understands what is happening to specific countries. Two, we have to understand what is our objective function. And three, if you don't know that space and how it can be navigated, please don't go there. Let's make sure that we package the resources that we know. Let me stop there because I just wanted to make sure those points so that it ignites debate that we wanted to structure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Appreciate it. And we have our co-chair, Commissioner Muchanga, who just joined. Could I ask Your Excellency for brief remarks so that we can start, as we're running a bit late, but please go ahead. We appreciate you joining.
Thank you very much. It's very, very difficult to make a statement in the middle of a meeting which has started. You may end up saying the wrong things, but all is indicating that I think the issue of reform of the global financial architecture is gaining ground in quite a number of spheres, especially in the G20. But the issue at hand is that although there has been quite some talk about it, we have not seen major deliveries. A lot of issues are required to really come into existence. There's talk of the need for increased concessional financing, the need for long-term financing so that we don't go into cyclical debt distress situation, is the case now when close to 21 of our countries are facing very heavy debt stress situations, and 3 have already defaulted. And according to UNDP this year, in April this year, what we are seeing is a trend where right now there are net financial outflows from the developing countries to the developed countries, because most of the developing countries are trying to make sure that they pay on time and in full their debt obligations so that they don't lose their credit ratings. Then, of course, the issue of making the multilateral development banks perform better by recapitalizing them, that's another issue that is emerging, and increasing the presentation of the developing countries in the multilateral development banks. All those issues are not yet delivered. So the high-level working group certainly has a role to play. And at the level of the African Union, we see your work as an input into the finance track of the G20, which is involved in these matters. And at the technical level, it has the International Financial Architecture Working Group, which fits into the meetings of the finance ministers and the central bank governors who make the ultimate decisions, but not ultimate decisions, the decisions, and recommend them to the leaders so that they go into the leaders' declaration. So your work can really produce evidence-based proposals which will feed into the work of the shapers who are going to start in July this year in negotiating the text which is going to be into the Leaders Summit. So the ball is in the court of this working group to see if you can produce something. Right now, I happen to be the shaper for the African Union. So if I get your proposals, I'll be able to start negotiating with the other shapers from G20 countries. I hope I've said the right thing. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and thank you all for your patience for the delays in starting. I think it's really such a timely, opportunity in terms of where we are, in terms of AFDB annual meetings being the theme of the year being actually global financial architecture reforms and how it can contribute to economic transformation, and the presidential and high-level dialogues that we've had in the last few days. So I think this is becoming a core issue for Africa at the highest level. We've heard heads of state talk about it. We've heard Your Excellency's ministers talk about it, and I think we are, also making progress. Let's also acknowledge things that have been achieved. We very thrilled and excited that we now have the African Union as has a chair in the G20, which means that this can convey our views, our ambitions, and our concrete proposals. So that's a historic milestone that we have achieved, but also we have another one to celebrate, which is the IMF board approval of using SDR as a hybrid capital, which allowed the rechanneling of IMF special drawing rights to multilateral development banks. So I think we need to perhaps remind ourselves that the hard work that all of us have put in terms of dedicating time and effort to advocate for this is paying off, perhaps slower than what we hope, but it is. So persistency will matter. And today we will be discussing an issue that has actually been also raised and voiced by President Ruto, issues of credit ratings and market access. And he said a number of very interesting remarks in his address about how Kenya was being actually punished by what's happening in Niger, even though, I mean, two different countries, two different fundamentals. So today, this is really kind of the type of discussion and presentation that we will have, and I look forward to hearing your views, comments, experience, and questions. So if the team can please put on the screen the presentation so that we can start. So today we're looking at issues of agenda for market access, and am I in control? Okay, so without further ado, let me just go through the, okay. So in terms of African sovereign Eurobond market evolution, we had the first African issuance was done by South Africa in 1995. And however, very few countries followed before 2008, before the global financial architecture, basically Mauritius, Morocco, Tunisia, and Seychelles. After 2010, and let's remember that this was a time of historically low interest rates. After 2010, Eurobond issuance saw a rapid increase and spiked in 2019 with annual issuances of $33 billion US. And as of August of 23, the outstanding amount of sovereign issuances reached $143 billion US. However, with the multiple crises that have happened, and especially global ones, since 2020, the market issuance, Eurobond issuance, have been shrinking. And this is due to a number of issues. Among them is, investor risk aversion, issues of foreign exchange and balance of payment pressures, eroding fundamentals because of the pandemic and the global shocks, and also unsustainable debt levels and cost of borrowing. Moving to perhaps reflecting on what are the benefits and challenges of that market access. In economics, usually in development, we think of a country getting market access as kind of like moving up in, the development trajectory, that it shows trust in the country's ability and interest of investors to actually finance it. So this makes us think, okay, what are the benefits of that? The benefits is that there is flexibility, there is no conditionality on that money in terms of what it's going to be used for. It increases, diversifies your source of financing, increasing investor base. Very importantly, and I think this is the point our dear minister just mentioned, in terms of providing a benchmark for corporate borrowing, for pricing. It also gives visibility for the country in terms of its performance, but there are challenges. It tends, of course, to be more expensive. High cost of borrowing is an issue. Very important one is the issue of market liquidity for these issuances, and almost no secondary market for these issuances for Africa. In addition, there tend to be a market volatility and shift of sentiment, and this is where the point that President Ruto is making about what happens in other African countries, that is completely in a different region with completely different fundamentals, affects different African countries. And actually, this is interesting because it relates, this is a topic of a paper I did many years ago, which shows that investors see African bonds as one asset class. There is no differentiation. Whereas in other regions, say Latin America or Europe, there is a clear differentiation. They are not lumped together as one asset class. So that's a disadvantage in terms of how markets react and what it means to the volatility of the bond market when a shock that is not related to the specific country happens in the continent. And of course, another challenge in this regard is actually the reliance on credit rating, because these issuance and its pricing depend on how, what type of credit rating you have. So what is the role of credit rating in market access? They are supposed to provide information to bridge information asymmetry between issuers and investors. And basically, the cost of borrowing reflects the risk of this issuance or the capacity, the risk of repayment. Not just for bond issuances, but also for other financing instruments as well. The sovereign credit ratings also set benchmarks, which we just talked about, benchmarks for firms, for banks and within the country and so on. So it's the benchmark on which other pricing gets determined. While, yes, unrated bond issuances can happen, credit ratings from credible rating agencies is a prerequisite for sovereigns to tap Eurobond market. The other issue in role of credit ratings in market access is the kind of the short-term nature and pro-cyclicality. And especially when countries are treated as one asset class, this becomes even more profound. You can see it more if you, graph the behavior, that becomes more obvious. So what are the main issues faced by African countries in credit ratings? Basically, we have two problems, misrating and mispricing. And the misrating, this is, you have here kind of a summary of, by globally and by region, of the number of countries that are rated and the ratings and how they changed before and after COVID pandemic. Over the period from 2020 to 2022, at least 18 of the 32 African countries rated by the big three rating agencies were downgraded, with some countries being downgraded multiple times. As a result, the average credit rating for African countries fell from B1 to B2. This is significantly inferior compared to other regions. As of now, only Botswana and Mauritius have investment grade ratings of big rating agencies. Based on historic data, we also see that the misrating translates into mispricing. So, for example, that misrating elevates yields on Eurobonds by about 1%, costing African countries $1.5 billion a year. And if we were to exclude actually South Africa and North African countries, African countries are paying at least over $2 billion in extra interest year due to bond market mispricing. So this has significant implication in terms of how it translates into debt service burden to countries. So what are the recommendations that we would like to table here today? First area is issue of how can we reduce subjectivity in credit ratings. And that can only happen through, by bridging information asymmetry, by ensuring better data and information qualitative matrix. So one area would be very important is establishing benchmarks based on macroeconomic fundamentals to enhance fairness and accuracy of sovereign ratings across countries. And that would help reduce information asymmetries. It will help also to bring more to the discussion the need to integrate longer-term factors in rating methodologies to avoid excessive weight on liquidity over solvency. Because liquidity, if it's a liquidity issue, there should be solutions. That's why institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and others is there to bridge. If it's a solvency issue, that's a different thing, and it's supposed to be more about the solvency rather than the liquidity. Second, the need to promote financial stability by avoiding penalizing preemptive restructuring. So as of now, both, whether it's the common framework, whether it's credit rating agencies, there are no incentive for countries to proactively take action before they hit a wall. So they, basically if they try to do that in advance, like, and which is the prudent thing to do, they will be penalized by credit rating agencies, and that doesn't make sense. If we want a better, debt management, if we want improved outlook for these countries going forward, we need to actually be encouraging more of that, giving incentives for countries to do that early on. So we need to analyze really what are the required reforms for credit rating agencies and identify relevant triggers to be considered as a breach of creditworthiness in that preemptive restructuring. And also there is a need to consider provision of credit enhancement schemes like sharing of preferred creditor status, which could incentivize a smoother treatment of preemptive restructuring by credit rating agencies. Another area which I believe is really crucial is the need for better checks and balances. We need to enhance regulatory framework and oversight. And let me just say, like, currently, if, for example, Kenya is unhappy with the rating it gets from Moody's, what can it do? Currently, it can only go to internal recourse mechanism within Moody's. That's it. But if I am, as a consumer, not happy with my bank, I can go through the recourse mechanism of the bank. I'm not happy with the response. I can take it to the regulator, which is the Financial Conduct Authority, or whatever it's called in different countries. So currently that does not exist. There is no oversight body that you can escalate to that keeps checks and balances. So there's a need to really look into this issue of regulation. And there's very interesting example, for example, that was done after the European crisis. Europe actually established a European regulator to have oversight of credit rating agencies. That's why currently you cannot be rating European countries based in the US or Dubai or anywhere else. You have to be in Europe and you have to be regulated by that entity. While our credit rating agencies, most of them are based either in London or in Dubai or wherever, but it's basically, they are not within the continent, which is also another thing about perhaps having a better sense of the dynamics of what is happening, but also they do not fall under the regulation within the content. So one of the key things that need to be considered, okay, what is the model? It can be at a regional level, meaning within Africa, but it can also be considered to be as a global regulator, something through the Financial Stability Board, establishing a global entity. There was discussion actually after the global financial crisis, and it was one of the suggestions in the Frank-Dodd Act, but it was never, it never materialized in the US, but it did in Europe. So it's one of the things that we need to really consider, think about, because that will give kind of, checks and balances for how these things are done. We also need to work with regional and global bodies to harmonize the rules and regulations within countries. In addition, we could consider, similar to what happened in Europe, to establish, Africa regional regulator. But of course, we have been talking, and this has been an issue that has been brought by President Ruto, before by President Macky Sall, and also President of South Africa, on the issue of creating African credit rating agencies. I think it's useful for establishing some baseline, for example, for companies, for banks, and so on, because it helps have a baseline for investors when they come or when they are interested. However, it's not a substitute for the sovereign rating by global entities, because for these, it takes years and decades really to build the trust and credibility and the benchmarking. So the idea that it will resolve the sovereign rating agency, I think maybe a bit optimistic. And this is one of the areas that we just need to take into account. It doesn't mean that we don't go there, but it means it's not the solution. We just need to be realistic. Then on the issue of another very important, I think this is really, if I may say, the core of what we need to do. We need to do our part. So yes, there is the regulation and keeping checks and balances and ensuring objectivity, but we need to do our part in reducing that subjectivity by providing reliable data, available, transparent, incredible data. And that means that they cannot resort to qualitative judgment and assessments. They have to use that data and benchmark against other countries to make the judgment on the rating. So that is an area that will be very critical to work on, and this is an area that the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods, IMF, World Bank, AFDB, all of us have a role to play in supporting countries in improving the quality and accessibility of data. And it's an area that also can benefit from peer-to-peer learning, and we need to ensure that it's standardized, because for credit rating agencies, it needs to be standardized. We need to ensure that it's available in a format that actually make it comparable across countries. And as you see here, you can see that the adherence to special dissemination standards is low in Africa. So we need to do better, definitely, in that area to enhance the outcome of these ratings process. Finally, we need to support actions by African sovereigns and their stakeholders. You can see here this heat map is a kind of like a summary of the transparency heat map for IDA eligible African countries. Some countries are doing well, but there's a significant room for improvement than what we're seeing here. So countries need to first understand, dissect, and understand thoroughly the processes and factors. Need to supply credit rating agencies with timely and accurate data, and this is an area that I think generally we don't do as well as maybe other regions. Communication, proactive communications. We need to really work on that and the strategies to do it both with credit rating agencies and investors. So this is very important. But also, countries should have effective risk and debt management strategies that would enhance also kind of the perception, and have to commit to improving data disclosure. So this is really in sum the suggestions and recommendation, and I look forward to hearing your questions and experience. Thank you. So we'll open the floor. Perhaps we can, I don't know if you want to start, Salim, or should we give the floor first to the ministers to give comments?
Maybe I can pass on the views of the IMF on the matter, and then the discussion can continue. Just to note that I'm here to represent the IMF as our African Department Director, Mr. Selassie, and his deputy, Mr. Kramarenko, who have been closely involved in this working group, are not able to attend this meeting in person. So they have asked me to represent IMF's view on their behalf. I am the IMF's resident rep here based in Nairobi. And let me start by passing on our appreciation to Dr. Morsi and her staff for the intellectual leadership in this important ongoing discussion on global financial architecture, and the results, as she highlighted, are evident. Now, on the paper, the need to improve the transparency and accountability of rating agencies is often discussed, and this report rightly highlights that enhancements in the rating process, including the role of the ratings committee, transparency, accountability, methodology, and data, could significantly improve the performance of rating agencies. On transparency, the report could further suggest that enhanced regularity and public disclosure requirements, along with incorporating independent review and input into rating decisions, would contribute to increased transparency. The need and room for improvement are clear, and we appreciate the candidness of the report and its recommendations. Now, regarding the specific elements outlined in the paper about the possible role of the IMF in supporting the reform of international credit rating systems, we have the following comments. The note suggests an anti-African bias in credit ratings. While we acknowledge existing issues in the credit rating process, the treatment of debt relief and various exchange operations, we find little evidence that African credit ratings often are misaligned with economic and political realities. There is a clear role for the IMF in capacity building and financial assistance to improve the resilience and economic position of African sovereigns, and the institution is focused on this effort. However, the IMF may not be positioned to meaningfully partner with African nations and credit rating agencies to improve the relevance and appropriateness of ratings, as well as how they are interpreted by investors, as the report suggests. The credit rating assessments are independent, and this is where regulation and independent reviews of credit rating agency assessments could play a greater role, as highlighted by Dr. Morsi in her presentation. Now, on data transparency and the consistent provision of data, we agree that these are essential to support rating decisions. Occasionally, we observe that countries stop publishing data, possibly out of fear of market reactions or rating downgrades. However, in the long run, such practices damage a country's credibility and standing with investors and rating agencies. Rating decisions have to be made with or without data, and in the absence of available data, these agencies tend to assume the worst. Hence, we encourage countries to improve transparency and consistency in providing economic data. Credit ratings are intended to provide a shorthand assessment of the likelihood of default, regardless of a country's location or cultural context. The expectation that any two sovereigns rated at the same level, for example B, should have approximately the same probability of defaulting on their debts. Now, empirical data challenges the notion of anti-African bias in credit ratings in our view. For example, between 2010 and 2023, sub-Saharan African nations rated B had a 22 to 30% default rate within 5 years, according to S&P and Moody's, which is significantly higher than the global average of 15 to 16%. This data suggests a bias towards leniency rather than discrimination against African sovereigns in credit ratings. Now, there may be a financial market bias against African risk due to various reasons, as evidenced by market pricing, leading to a certain element of procyclicality, and we see merit in this dynamic to be further explored in the report. On the proposal in the report for a potential Pan-African credit rating agency, we see its usage for external debt of African countries might be limited, given that most investors of external debt are based in Europe or the US. However, a local rating agency that rates local issuers, such as local corporates, in addition to sovereigns, could help develop local capital markets. Finally, we see the recommendation that credit rating agencies should consider long-term risks and opportunities as challenging. The role of credit ratings in the current financial architecture is to assess the capacity to repay over the medium-term horizon, incorporating long-term issues such as climate change deviates from a quantitative probabilistic data-based approach and requires a different type of expertise. And African countries could be especially exposed to future climate risks due to limited policy space, and given the relative nature of credit rating assessments, their credit ratings could be affected more towards possible downgrades if the suggested approach is adopted. With these comments, let me thank Dr. Mosi and her team once more for this valuable paper and their recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Salim. Appreciate it. Okay, I have responses to all that, but I'll hold my horses. A lot of responses, but I'll hold my horses because I'd like to hear from the ministers first. But we'll come back to that. So if ministers, sorry? After the ministers, yeah. So we'll give the floor to ministers. So who? Zimbabwe, please go ahead. And okay, sorry, did you? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would want to focus on the issue of data and transparency, because I think the foundation for these assessments or ratings is data. And our experience in terms of the economic indicators, etc., I think what we have seen in Zimbabwe is really the differences between what we produce as authorities and what the IMF missions produce in terms of GDP data, any other financial data, etc. And these play a critical role in the rating agencies as they do their work. So for us, I think the critical issue is convergence of data because if you look at some of the projections we have seen, it's like we're talking of two completely or three completely different countries, yet the same country. So I think these data asymmetries, I think to me, are very critical, and we need that convergence. For example, in Zimbabwe, we found that our own margin of error was much smaller in terms of the forecast than what the fund mission had produced. And again, data would have been published, and that is an implication on the rating. So I think that's, for me, as African countries, we need that asymmetry of data and transparency so that we can really make an impact on what we are trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Swetine.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And thank you for the presentations. I think it's enlightening and interesting. What we have found, and that is that I think if we're talking of architecture within the global financial system, especially around the rating agencies, a big problem that we believe we need to try to fix. At the moment, Africa is suffering the worst consequences as a continent now. So you've got separate islands also, which might be slightly worse, as a continent, suffering the worst consequences of climate change. But have not contributed really towards the climate change. I think 4% have contributed towards it. What then happens, which again one can try and blame and shift blame, but I don't think there's any intent behind, obviously, behind that unfairness that is all working out to be. What we then find, though, is the rating agencies, and then in the ratings on our countries, they assess, which is true, that the risk in our countries has gone up because of climate change. You're having more floods, you're having more droughts, everything else, and hence the rating, and hence you get downgraded because of the higher risk in climate change. The downgrades means that we end up costing our taxpayers a whole lot more in raising debt, especially in the commercial space. I think the entities, World Bank, ADB, IMF around the room, it's not as applicable there, but in the commercial space where we raise funding, it's very applicable what your rating is. So by having, where the money comes from is the same developed countries which have caused the problem in the first place. And so I know it's a little bit rough what I'm saying, but I think we need to recognize that somehow the rating agencies, in working on climate change risks in the ratings, are actually causing what is already an unfair situation to be almost an abusive situation, where countries that have caused the problem, entities within those countries, end up making even more money out of the problem that they have caused in the first place. And if we talk of fairness in the global financial architecture in relation to rating agencies, we have to find a better solution here. This is just, it's turning what might be an unintended problem from the developed to the undeveloped to an actual abuse of finances in that same system. We can blame the downgrades over the last 5 years to COVID-19, but I think sitting around the room, we know a lot of those downgrades have come from climate impacts on our countries. And so I just want to raise and put on the table is to say, when we're talking of architecture, we also really need to find a way. And we can say as a continent, let us develop our own rating agency. But unfortunately, the golden rule applies. You as the gold makes the rules. And I'm not so sure a solution, we can obviously give it a try, but I'm not so sure that our rating agency will be taken seriously by the developed world. So from that sense, we need to find a solution in the current architecture around these discussions and find a fairer solution to it, which obviously might be the multilaterals in the room, just playing a bigger role in that, so that we're not as exposed to commercial external funding. But within all of this, transparency can help. We fully agree. But there is a fundamental problem in the architecture in the first place between us, ratings, rating agencies, and funding from the developed world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senegal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morsi, for an excellent presentation. I'll just make two small points on the recommendation you made on having an official regulator for the credit rating agencies. And I would suggest perhaps, since they are independent institutions, we might be able to suggest that they have a self-regulatory agency, perhaps, that can sort of reinforce their own accountability. So accountability can be self-imposed rather than perhaps an official regulator. That's my first point. The second point is that, sometimes a liquidity problem can lead to a solvency problem. And it's true that data and transparency is important, to impact the perception of risk. But I think we need to do more work in deepening of domestic financial markets. Because if our own domestic financial markets are deep, with depth, breadth, and liquidity and resiliency, then we might be able to provide data that is more relevant in terms of signaling what the cost of credit should be, and then comparing that to what we are charged, the cost of debt in international markets for our securities that are not liquid. So a domestic capital market that is liquid could then objectively signal the real sovereign risk, and then provide a market information that is closer perhaps to reality than the perception to the extent that our securities are not liquid in international markets. And listing also, I think the local currency securities could be listed abroad. There are ways in which, they could be traded abroad, so that the information that will come from that trading could then inform the risk on the dollar or euro denominated debt that is not traded, and therefore is maybe not signaling the appropriate information. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Minister Sarr. Comments from any other? Yes, please, Rwanda.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Hanan, and thank you for the brilliant presentation. Just one comment. I like the two proposals. One, to see how we can achieve better ratings using the existing credit rating agencies. Two, the idea of establishing an African regional credit ratings. On how to use, how to achieve better ratings using even existing credit agencies, the issue of quality, availability of quality data was raised, and this, I think, it's really a challenge. And here we can take the opportunity. We have all institutions here that can really provide assistance to improve our, to strengthen our national statistical institutions in our respective countries to build credible and quality data. This is something we can do, not only targeting the rating agencies, but also it is helpful for our own policy making. Number two, you suggest that we could also improve our communications by engaging credit rating agencies, by providing data, quality data in a timely manner, but also engaging our investors. Good advice. I think we could do something, but also sometimes investors ask us actually to come to the market to do some kind of roadshow, not targeting issues, but just updating investors on our recent developments in our economies. But beyond these the rating issues, the overall narrative on Africa remains a challenge. The perception on Africa has also influenced any judgment, any decision about Africa. This is a broader problem that also need to be addressed. On the second proposal to establish the African regional credit rating, yes, we understand that this is a process, and it will take many years for the agents to be recognized, to get credibility, but it's a process. But at the start, we need to ensure that it is not seen as an instrument made to favor Africa. On the contrary, it should be seen as a rigorous mechanism to rate African economies with a better knowledge of Africa. That could be that's the only difference. That it could have really a better knowledge of the real economic situation in Africa. So without that, it will be just seen as a way to favor Africa and to be hard really to get credibility. So from the start, the objective should be clear, and also the difference between the existing agencies and the one we are intending to establish. But one does not replace the others. These are two parallel approaches that we could address simultaneously. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful comments. Morocco.
Thank you, Dr. Morsi. Sorry for coming in a bit late. I just wanted to support what Rwanda just said about the need to change the narrative about Africa, because this is a very penalizing issue when it comes to the risk perception of African economies. And I think it is up to the trans-African institutions, such as the African Union, maybe to be more active in trying to change the way Africa is perceived as a continent. We keep hearing talks about how Africa's potential is attractive, about the many opportunities that African economies can offer. But still, when we get to the financial market, we are faced with these very persistent risk perceptions, which result in either a very limited market access, or a very high cost for African sovereigns. So I think we, as African countries, can do a lot to try and change this narrative. I think there's also a role that can be played by different international institutions, such as the IMF, through their reports and assessments, to maybe provide a more, I would say, a more realistic view of the situation of African economies, because I do understand that international investors and rating agencies do rely on those reports as part of their assessment. So I think this is also a part of maybe the solution to this misperception of African risk, African sovereign's risk. And finally, I do support your proposal, Dr. Morsi, to have a more active information dissemination with the credit rating agencies, because if credit rating agencies cannot access reliable data about African economies, they will rely on whatever sort of data is available, which can be, of course, very approximative. So it will result in penalizing perception. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Hasset. I don't see any ministers that want intervention. We'll go to Hasitu and then Afrexim Bank. Hasitu.
Thank you very much, and let me also thank very much you, Dr. Mosi, and this audience for all the support that you provided for the SDR channeling. We all own this success, so thank you very much. Appreciated. Battle 1-1, there was a solution. Battle 2-1, approval of hybrid capital as SDR channeling, and then there is the big battle, getting shareholders and donors to provide resources. So this is a battle that starts today. So let me go, and thank you very much for the very insightful presentation that you've provided. A few things that I want to discuss. So fully agree, and this is something that I've discussed before in this audience, was the local currency capital markets. We need to have a local currency capital markets. None of the developed countries go through another country's market in order to get their resources. I've started my careers at the African Development Bank. Well, I joined the African Development Bank more than 23 years ago. And at the time, the discussion about local currency was, but it's far, we need an immediate solution. So if 20 years ago we had addressed this, we would be in a different situation today. So it's imperative that we work on our local currency capital markets. Talking about the reforms. So as you know, credit rating agencies are independent. But following the crisis, because there was a lack of transparency, there's been reforms. So credit rating agencies in the past were accused of lack of transparency, there was rating shopping, conflicts of interest. There was a reform that was passed by the US where they asked for more transparency, more accountability and more competition. And it was quite important from the point of view of the African Development Bank, because it allowed us to have, to be able to look at the criteria and to be able to see where we were versus the criteria and to challenge sometimes. So, and at the MDB level, multilateral development bank level, we are having a regular engagement with the credit rating agencies and pushing them, understanding first better their approach. Sharing information, challenging some of the assumptions or the criteria. And I can see also that at the African Development Bank, we've challenged rating agencies on specific metrics that they were using, and they changed it. So that dialogue is important, but we need to go beyond that. But my advice would be, more dialogue with and regular engagement with the credit rating agency, and in order for them to better appreciate the work. There is also one thing that I want to say, and someone said it, and I think it was the representative from the IMF. You were talking about the credit rating agency bias and financial bias. Credit rating agency assessment and financial markets assessments. And I read these are two things. As a AAA rated, all AAA do not get the same pricing. Our pricing for the African Development Bank is better than some AAA and worse than other AAA. So it has to do, so there is the financial markets perception and there is the credit rating. Another important thing, many of the large asset managers do not even look at the credit rating. They do their own assessment. And that's what drives their decision to invest or not, and that's what drives the cost at which they're going to invest. So with regards to the bonds, so it's important that the lead managers are chosen very well. It is important that the country is in a position to monitor its secondary market. Why do you need to choose well your lead manager? Is because you were talking about the liquidity of the bonds. They are responsible for ensuring that there is trading and liquidity in the bond. And you should be able to say, if you see that the manager is not, doing what it's supposed to do, you should be able to see that and then remove them from the next, from the next round of discussion. So it's very important to ensure that the countries have capital markets experts within their team that are able to look into that. It's important that they do regular roadshow, investor engagement. And the investor engagement should be not just selling the countries, selling the transaction, but it's about an in-depth review, because the work that you do with the investor is the exact same work that you're doing with the credit rating agencies. Because as I said, sitting there are risk managers who are listening, who are looking at the data, who are making the assessment and making the recommendations as to what is the price at which the bond should be bought. So that is very important. The pricing of a bond is a function of the risk assessment and the bond performance. A bond that doesn't perform well, you will see the cost, the cost at which the country will be able to re-enter being worse than the previous one. Why? Because you need to have a program of issuance. There needs to be regular issuance in the capital markets, because these are the things also that they look at. They look at the liquidity, the credit, and the performance of the bond. So these are things that I believe also need to be taken into account. And what are the advantages of the benefits of having an African credit rating agency? So the African credit rating agency, if you have an independent rating agency now, it's very clear today. The international investors are not going to look at the rating of that agency. However, why it is important? It's important first in the local currency credit capital markets. It's important because sovereign countries are going to give more trust to the findings of that credit rating agency. And it will guide them in deciding in deciding what route to take. So for example, if you're rated by S&P and the African credit rating agency rates you much better, you can have a discussion with S&P and say, on criteria A, B, C, and D, this is a justified assessment. What do you say? So that is important. It's also important if S&P and that credit rating agency have the same outcome, it makes the country step back and decide, what should be the course of action. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Hassatou. Appreciate it. Afrexim Bank.
Thank you, Dr. Morsi, for another excellent presentation. I just wanted to go back to a point that I think has been mentioned in this room, and that's in terms of the rating agencies. I mean, you mentioned the challenges, information asymmetry as one of the reasons. Some people in this room have also talked about lack of data and so on, but I actually don't think that is where the problem really lies, because, for example, I ran the statistics agency in Nigeria for 10 years, so we didn't have any challenges with the IMF, World Bank figures. They were aligned. They used our figures, the rating agencies used these figures. So, but even when there's no dispute to the figures, nobody's complaining about lack of data, that subjective nature decision that they still take, even when the data is aligned, was still happening. You have a situation where rating agencies cannot even explain to you the basis for which they are taking a decision, because they see the data, they look at it, they agree. I'll give you an example. Recently, you have the IMF World Bank's outlook for Africa is positive, but they go with a general opinion that the entire continent is negative. So you ask them, but even though you are using these figures and the outlook is more positive, they are saying that GDP is going to grow stronger in 2024, debt is going to improve. Why are you assuming that why are you assuming the rating should be worse next year than it is currently, when all the indicators are suggest it's going to improve? So even when you have all those data intact, I think the main issue is that narrative that exists, and that is the kind of, you have situations where all your indicators are looking good, but because there's a political instability or a coup in Niger, for example, they suggest the outlook in Kenya or South Africa, many miles away, is also affected, despite the fact that we know that contagion within the continent is limited, because the links don't exist as strongly. We don't trade with ourselves. The financial flows are not within ourselves. So why would something happen at one end of the continent when they are when they're not direct? Most African countries have more dealings with outside Africa. So why would a problem happening in one corner of Africa be used will be used as a narrative to affect the entire continent? So that's the point I'm trying to make, that yes, we can get our data right, we can ensure that we give them as much information as possible. The data might even be aligned with the IMF or the World Bank, but as long as that subjective aspect, that narrative exists, and I think that's why we need to pay a lot more attention as long as that narrative exists, it doesn't matter how well we get the data, how well we submit the data. If that perception still exists, everything will look okay, but they will take a decision that suits that narrative. I think that's part of the problem, and one of the major problems we're having, how to change that narrative. And I guess how do you replace a narrative? How do you change the narrative? I think it's by replacing it with another narrative, and I think we need to work more effectively as well in that regard. Otherwise, everything we do that we have discussed in this room might not be as effective as we want it to be. Thank you.
Thank you.
I forgot to make that point about the rating agencies, but I do agree with all the issues that are coming up. I do agree that we need a rating agent, but I had opposed President Muchanga when he wanted us to start a rating agency. I argued that we need to invest very heavily on rating technology so that all of us understand what is happening. If I get his last point, suppose you are rating Kenya and I go to you as a rating and I want to see what you used in the rating. And then I want to be, and I've done that, we just argue or we just look at the objectivity of the data, then we'll come to an objective rating. Let me tell you one example. It's 2022, I was sitting with several rating agencies during the annual meeting. And we talked, and I said that, I asked a question, whom do you report to? Because all of us, if you want to be, you cannot be just the only, should I say, cowboy out there. You have to be reporting to someone, because in a game without rules, it cannot be a game. There has to be rules of the game must be adhered to. And then what is the incentive? So they fumbled. Some of them said World Bank. But you can't imagine. And I said, no, the World Bank does not regulate you. So it means they are not regulated. But now, the only way we can deal with them is actually having a knowledge base to counter that. Remember, when we wanted to buy back the Eurobond, a portion of the Eurobond, internal discussions somewhere, I can't tell where, went on that if we buy back, it will be treated as a distress. And the story was carried by the Bloomberg. They regretted that story because I put them head on. If I have your debt, and somehow I get into some resources, there's nothing that prevents you from paying you ahead of time, isn't it? But the negotiation we can have is how much haircut you can get, isn't it? This is reasonable, but they didn't want to get that. So in a sense, if you get, for example, it is during now the rise of the Eurobond is what has raised these credit rating agencies into a high corner. And then we need now to say what knowledge base do we have. My analysis has shown that most of them, or if you look at all of them, there are 200 to 300 indicators that they use. But what triggers decision is just about 3 to 5 indicators. Come with those indicators and you pin them down. They have nowhere to run. So essentially, it is us we should not actually say, it is the information processing. Don't even say information asymmetry, because we provide this data, isn't it? The kind of data that you use, the 3 to 5, is actually the common variables, physical space, debt distress, and all that. But if we are doing that for the market, you see, during the global financial crisis, we actually said, there was a saying that was going around saying that if you want to be the only game in town, you'll be the only game in town. The problem is that it won't last long, isn't it? You remember that? It is the same thing. Once we develop our own rating technology, capacity for rating technology, the game in town will be resolved. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So, because we're running out of time, let me just thank you so much for the really excellent and insightful comments that have been made, and I think I agree with the majority, but wanted to come back to some of the comments of the IMF. Salim is already looking at me. I'm an evidence-based person, so I think when we say, you know, the bias does not exist, I can give you the assessment and the numbers and the figure, and you give me yours, and then we can have a objective discussion. But it cannot be without figures and analysis to prove it. We have the figures and analysis to prove it. You want to counter? Give us yours. So that's on this point. On the other thing, there is a general agreement on the need to work on data, on communication, on reaching out and changing the narrative, and I think all are spot on. There are, I think, some of the issues are open questions that we will need to look into, including, for example, the issues in climate and what does it mean, because that's not a straightforward issue. But I think it's clear, like, we need to build the capacity, and I very much agree with Minister Juna on the issue of needing to build capacity to understand what is being done, and then how do you do the counter argument, and understanding, and if there are things that are not transparent in terms of countries that you believe are similar to you but are getting different treatment, we need to put this on the table and have, ask for more disclosure from the rating agencies themselves about how this is done versus ours. So I think there is a lot of issues to do on both sides. I thank you very much for this excellent and insightful comments, and we've gone over time. And the minister have to go to a statutory meeting. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the next meeting.